Well, I make that 2 o'clock, so good afternoon and welcome everyone to the latest webinar in our Adapting to Change series. Today we'll be turning our attention to risk management and business continuity and resilience, which I imagine will be very high on your agendas at the moment. Before we get underway, just a few housekeeping points. We've centrally muted everyone, but if you could just check that you are muted just to reduce background noise and improve the overall sound quality, that would be great. As I'm sure many of you are, all of our presenters are currently working remotely, so if there are any technical issues, please do bear with us. We'll get them sorted as quickly as we possibly can. A copy of the slide deck and the recording of today will be sent to you all in the next couple of days, so do keep an eye out for that. You can find much more content relating to the coronavirus on our website, linked from our homepage. If you're looking for some more information, do take a look after this session. We do want this session to be interactive and we will be responding to your questions. So if you could submit your questions using the Q&A feature on your screens, we find this the best way of doing things. My colleague will be monitoring these and will pose them to us at the end of the session. Okay, some introductions to the people who will be speaking to you today. My name is Mike Gennar. I'm a specialist assurance partner at RSM and I will be setting the scene and looking at the changing risk profile that we're currently facing. Colleague Adam Likrish, a Risk Assurance Director, will be giving you some top tips for risk management. And Sheila Pancholi, who's our Technology Risk Partner, will be looking at what we call the new approach to business resilience. Okay, briefly, some obvious context, I guess, and that is all organisations and individuals have clearly been impacted by the current pandemic. It's very, very unlikely that things will go back to the way they were. The phrase, the new normal, seems to be bandied around very much nowadays, and I think that is certainly where we're going to be going forward. But I think we can learn from these events, so our future will be shaped by the lessons that we learn from how we've dealt with the pandemic and the things we've had to put in place to make our lives work more effectively. Okay, so let's look at the changing risk profile. We can consider this future in many ways, but I have grouped it into 6 areas, I think many of which overlap. I'll briefly canter through each of these in turn before handing over to Adam and Sheila, who will bring out some aspects specific to risk and crisis management. So let's start with financial. The health of the nation, our businesses and for ourselves revolves around our finances. That is self-evident. In accessing government funding, we need to keep sight of compliance with the schemes, completeness and accuracy of claims, and adherence to the not working mechanisms. HMRC can and will audit these processes. Liquidity and cash flow may have benefited from government schemes along with bank facility drawdowns, but future financial liquidity could be impacted by a number of areas, not least of which settlement of deferred VAT and taxes, changing settlement terms with supplier and payment cycles, the very real time lag between the costs of return and the generating and receiving of the cash from that return, robustness of your cash flow forecasts, indeed the financial health of our customers requiring credit checks and of course their ability to pay, and then of course the longer term access to liquidity. In terms of pensions, the value and funding of defined benefit schemes is impacted by the fall in market values and of course future corporate distributions. What about changes in financial controls? We've had to adapt. Have these changes been robust? And what will they look like when we return? Changes in customer and supplier payment patterns. Are we going to be moving to in advance, part payments, regular instalments, deferrals? Pricing will be a risk later as productivity will have been impacted and we need to recover the cost of lockdown. The question is, can you achieve this from a revenue point of view from where you stand at the moment? Fraud is obviously a risk and an area which we are seeing increasing prevalence, including things from customers, suppliers, staff, management override and manipulation of payments, valuation of services, valuation of works. The list goes on, and Sheila will touch a little bit more on this later on. Obviously, cost management will remain core to what we do for some time. Pausing projects and investment, tight control over discretionary spend. But of course, we will bear new and additional costs of enabling a return to work, notably things from signage to facilities and many, many more items. Okay, turning to business operations. We're all talking about the return to work, but whatever our business, our operational risks have changed. Have we got the ability to turn the tap on and off if the road ahead is bumpy? Have you considered this in your plans? Are there opportunities to get ahead of the others in your market space? As mentioned previously, supply chain is going to be key. The financial health and resilience, generally, businesses go to the wall after a recession, not during it. Are your suppliers able to return? Can you access alternative supply chains? But clearly all of this relies on the right relationships and communication with your suppliers. Return to work also brings other issues. IR35, it's still going ahead. And what about the changing views on the gig economy and zero-hours contracts? How does that affect your workforce plans? The time and costs associated with going back to work will be many and varied. The future costs of working from home and making sure that staff are well cared for. And if they are working from home, how effective is the supervision? How will you manage your team if they are remote? Home working may have provided some efficiencies, but what about operations and the social distancing rules? Further, regulatory and compliance requirements. Regulators may not relax the rules or may increase the requirements depending upon the risks. Contracts are a big issue. Where are you in terms of your contractual arrangements and renegotiation? We are all in this together may be today's mantra, but may change when we all need to look after our own businesses when we get back. Oh, and of course, I almost forgot the elephant in the room, Brexit. It's still out there. Okay, let's look at governance. We've seen during lockdown a move to a more expedient, focused on people and protecting the business and cash model. But what about when emerging from lockdown? Speed of risk may now be more manageable, but is your risk management model fit for purpose in a changed environment? Business planning risks will change. Plans will need to change quickly, adapt, and be flexible. There'll be need for more real-time monitoring of performance, such as KPIs, faster period close, automated reporting. And in protecting the business and possibly reshaping it, you'll also need to assess your channels to market. Are they changed? Areas and markets that you want to be in, and not least of which, your brand and reputation. Turning now to safe working. Whatever emerging from COVID means, health and well-being of customers, staff, and suppliers will be central to the consideration of risk as it affects all aspects of daily life and operations. Looking at some of the sectors we're working with, we see the following. Construction, lengthening of project timescales. Factories and laboratories, changes to processes and production lines, particularly manual processes, shift patterns, PPE availability, and cleaning regimes. Restaurants and hospitality following yesterday's announcement, the redesign of the offering and the impact on the business model. Is this a permanent change to meet customers' fears and regulatory needs, or is it temporary? Offices, floor plans, larger for social distancing or smaller for working from home? How are your interactions with the landlord? What are you discussing? What about tracing staff contacts in mixed-use buildings? I'm not sure the app it will be ready, certainly not from the PM's queues today. Retail. Have channels to market changed permanently? Are we grasping the opportunity to accelerate digital means of trading and communicating with customers and suppliers? Let's talk about people. People are and should be at the heart of our thinking. Their fears and anxieties relating to return to work, their well-being, communication and future employment. Some issues to grapple with include that anxiety over travel, especially in terms of public transport. Will staff want to come back to the business if they have to use public transport? The differing national stances across the UK on lockdown and its easing will be a problem for businesses across the UK. More cars means more congestion, delays in travel, including the impact on logistics. Have you got the parking facilities to deal with people turning up in cars? Home working has been invaluable, but on a more permanent basis, we need to consider decent working environment versus the kitchen table. And of course, as humans, we're all fallible. So what do you do when someone does not maintain social distancing in the workplace? There will be a need for new operating protocols. There will be a need for a code of conduct, and it will involve HR if things go wrong. Turning now finally to technology, and I won't steal Sheila's thunder here, but COVID has provided a real opportunity to accelerate some digital transformations. in terms of the way of working, working from home, and accessing customers. I mean, technology was moving at a pace pre-COVID, but the pandemic has further accelerated the technology landscape we live in. We have seen an increased adoption of the use of technologies such as 5G, AI, big data, and cloud computing and technologies played a key part in remote working and enhanced healthcare during the pandemic. These technologies have shown remarkable results in detection, treatment, and social distancing, and have helped to reduce the impact of the crisis. Broadband connectivity and teleworking have enabled millions of businesses to keep going, support global value chains, and prepare for recovery. Remote online teaching has enabled the continued delivery of education for many of our children of all ages. But with increased connectivity, we create more opportunities for cybercrime, something Sheila will cover in greater detail as we go through the presentation. A quick canter through. I'll now hand over to Adam to look at risk management in more detail. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Mike. Afternoon, everybody. So Mike's just given a really good overview there of the changing risk landscape and the profile that we've all experienced over the last 3 to 4 months, and what we are likely to experience moving forward, at least till the turn of the year. However, how we manage those risks and how we continue to have an effective risk management framework in place is what we're going to try and cover off here. So that the first one is around not throwing governance out the window. As Mike has already alluded to, things like financial controls, purchasing extra equipment, and items like that are all things which have needed to have been done with relative speed, given the last few months. So maintaining a level of discipline around decision making is crucial. So when we look backwards, can we justify the decisions that we made, why we made them, how we made them, and what the basis for those decisions was? Because how we've interacted with our colleagues, committees and boards, audit committees, for example, over the last few months will have been very different to how we would have done it in the past, using Microsoft Teams, Skype, having timely information on which to make decisions on. And that is one of the really crucial functions around a board, where we're looking at oversight, decision making, scrutiny, that level, maintaining that level of responsibility as a board has, how risk feeds into this and adds value to that decision making process is really, really important. Even more so at this point in time, especially with the speed in which decisions are needed to be made. Secondly, on there is around coronavirus is not a risk in its own right. So what we're looking at here is obviously you'll have a risk profile for your organisations, and understanding the impacts of coronavirus upon those risks looking forwards is really important, because that will help to understand the control environment that you have in place, whether more action needs to be taken, and then where assurances can be sought on the effectiveness of those controls. So we could be looking here at the impacts of coronavirus on workforce related risks, how we deliver our services or products or manufacturing, the financial viability of the organisation, and also how we manage its reputation through this. There's been much discussion in the past around whether pandemics or coronavirus should sit on a risk register. But for me, this is all about how an organisation responds. It's very hard to prevent a pandemic as an organisation. So it's about how you respond to that, because obviously that will help you survive any of the effects that come through in the following months and years. The third one on there is around looking at the opportunities. So we've all had to work in a different way over the last few months, and we're likely to have to do so moving forwards. So there are some changes, some positive and some negative ones, learning those lessons quickly in case we have wave 2, for example, as we've seen in the news over the last couple of days. And how do we make those changes long lasting, so that we could be looking at things around technology changes. We've had to embrace technology to be able to work remotely, financial changes, where that could be savings, it could be through how we deliver services, value generating activities, and do we really understand what they are so that we can drive that forward and manage the risks associated to that. So looking at the new normal, do we just want to go back to the way that we were? Or actually, are we looking to embrace some change and change our business model fundamentally? Again, it will have risks associated with it. However, hopefully those benefits will outweigh, and you can manage those effectively. The fourth one on here is around spreadsheets. So we've all seen a weighty risk register spreadsheet from an Excel document, I would imagine, at some point. And really what we're talking about here is being able to see the wood for the trees. What's really important to that executive management team or that board that's contained within that risk register, and ultimately managing some of the risk information and action chasing through to implementation can be very challenging. So what we're looking for here is, where we want real-time information to make quick decisions and risk-based decision making, is around investing in some low-cost tech solutions to drive out some of that, the inefficiency and unnecessary admin that goes with making sure that that information is timely. So looking at technology solutions to manage those workflows, I think is really important. And number 5 on there, because things happen, which leads me nicely onto my next slide, which sort of, I think, encompasses the whole point here. So here we've got the a snippet from the World Economic Forum report. If you're not familiar with it, it's released every year. This is January 2020's copy. And essentially it's comprised or put together by 750 global risk experts and decision makers who come up with what they perceive global risks to be for the next, this is 10 years on your screen, but it could be 5, it could be current. Now, the biggest challenge with this is, that's great, it's a global risk report, but actually it's about what that means to you. So we're going from global to local. For the top spectrum that we have on there, these are the top 10 impact risks for the next 10 years, going from left to right. So the infectious diseases is actually sitting 10th in the list in terms of impact. And note the timing, January 2020, we weren't necessarily in the situation that the globe finds itself now. So perhaps there'll be some revisions for the next because this isn't going to go away necessarily. It may come back in different guises, but infectious diseases, coronavirus, etc., just goes to show how vulnerable we are. So looking at some of the others, I'm not going to talk about the information infrastructure breakdown or cyber attacks, because Sheila's going to come on to that shortly. But this is that they've come to the fore, and I think coronavirus has pushed some of these risks in terms of their impact, and are they as significant as we thought they were before. The chart underneath is around likelihood. So here, the most likely, on the left-hand side, we've got the top 5 environmental type risks. I think it's key to pick out here that the climate action failure risk appears on both, towards the left-hand side. And obviously, we will have all seen some of the pictures and the news articles from various media outlets over the course of the last few months showing what fewer planes in the sky means, fewer cars on the road, less boats, less transport, and the impacts that that's had on global climate. Obviously a long way to go, but I think here we need to start looking at how we don't lose those impacts. What does that mean for your organisation and the way that you do business, you run your business? The other one, which I'm just going to pick out there, is around the asset bubble. So Mike mentioned earlier around pensions. And we're seeing recently around commercial real estate, different ways of working, inability to collect rents, assets not being as worth as much as they perhaps used to be pre-coronavirus period. And what's the impact on pensions from that? As we have less office space, a lot of it is tied up in there, and could that lead to bigger deficits which organisations and businesses just can't handle? So that's the World Economic Forum report. It's a very pricey. I would encourage you to try and get your hands on a copy, because it's really interesting in how you can bring that back to your own organisations and feed that into your own risk registers, because there will be something in there for all of us. So that's the risk management section covered. Obviously, that's just one part of organisational resilience. And I'm going to pass over to Sheila now to cover off the business continuity, crisis management, etc.
Super, that's great. Thank you, Adam, and afternoon all. So just moving on to cyber, I do feel as if I can't have any webinar at the moment without having mentioned the word cyber attack. Extremely common, obviously very topical. As you saw through the slides that both Mike and Adam talked through, it's a real significant risk. It's one that we're all very familiar with and one that's most definitely not going to go away. So what have we seen over the past few weeks and months during the pandemic? Well, we've certainly seen that cyber attacks have increased globally since the onset of the pandemic. And that's no real surprise, really, if we think about the environment that we're now operating in and what that sort of technology landscape looks like. When we're in our corporate organisations, when we're in our office locations, those corporate organisations basically have IT infrastructure which provides a healthy measure of security and protection. And so it should, because most organisations have spent a lot of money putting that infrastructure in place. In fact, many organisations spend in the millions of pounds on IT security. But obviously, any time an organisation can't fully control those access points, particularly through the end users, then it's very difficult to determine what you're trying to protect. And in effect, what we're saying is those endpoints could be left open to vulnerabilities. And what we have right now is, with everybody working from home, a huge increase in those endpoints. It's very, very difficult to determine how secure things are. So most staff are relying on home network infrastructures and personal devices. And in general, what we find is that, you know, if we're going to compare the security and the controls in place over an office environment, a corporate network infrastructure, it would be very, very different to what we have in place at home. So nowhere near the same level of security, hence why one of the reasons why we've seen a spike in cybercrime. So if we just move on to this next slide, basically what this slide shows you is what we call our data footprint or our cyber footprint. And it's a really good way to visualize what we mean by those endpoints, because if we think about our working environment, most businesses, in effect, we're providing some kind of service in one form or another. We're consuming services from other entities. We're engaged in services with lots of different third parties in lots of different forms. And then obviously we've got things that we're outsourcing as well. So we might have things that we put in the cloud. We might have software as a service. We might have managed services. So lots of different endpoints that come into the equation when we're building up this picture. But what's important about this picture is you need to know where those boundaries are, because if you don't know where the boundaries are, you don't know what you're trying to protect, and you can't basically ring fence your security around that boundary. And in effect, having the boundary there helps you to establish what external threats you're also facing as well, which is why it's so important to be able to visualize this. So what have we seen over the past few months in terms of cyber threats and cyber attacks? Well, what I've done on this slide is I've just sort of summarized 5 key groupings of the types of cyber attacks that are very common, have been common for quite some time in terms of these groupings. Many of these fall into what we call social engineering types of cyber attacks. Some of these terms you might be familiar with: phishing, whaling, malware. Basically, it's our new age term for various types of virus attacks. Identity theft can happen in lots and lots of different ways. And then we've got spam emails, basically overloading a network infrastructure to the point where basically it stops operations, or it basically ring fences data. And the two sort of most common ones that we've seen increasing, and particularly significantly increasing during the pandemic, have definitely been around phishing and whaling. And in effect, phishing is a targeted attack, either at a small group of individuals, or it could be an entire organization of individuals, usually via email, text, or other forms of social messaging. And in effect, what you get is an email or a text which looks like it's come from a known person. you click on that and it might ask you to provide more data. It might be that it downloads a malware program into the back of your system, which then spreads very quickly. So, used very, very successfully, very easy to deploy. And then Whaling, a similar kind of social engineering tool, but in effect, Whaling, the only difference is that it's very targeted at either senior executives or individuals within an organization who basically have positions of authority, particularly approval over funding, or basically being able to approve finance levels as well. So this is very much about targeting an individual who could maybe approve for funding to be transferred, or to pay a supplier, do something very quickly because they have that level of authority. So very successful cyber attacks on the increase as well. So just talking about those in a little bit more detail, as I mentioned, phishing. Phishing generally tends to exploit vulnerable people anyway. The whole idea of phishing attacks is that you look for the vulnerable, and that sort of term vulnerable can mean lots of different things from a cyber attacker's perspective. In this instance, what we saw was that a lot of the phishing scams were actually exploiting our concerns about the virus, particularly when we went into lockdown very quickly in the first few months. So what we saw was a lot of messages, a lot of emails coming through that looked like they were coming from health organisations, charities, other organisations who were providing us with updates on what was going on with the pandemic, and in effect they were phishing scams. And then we had sort of the other grouping, which was attacks which were being targeted at remote users, so that's all of us in our home working environments, but basically looking for technology that was insecure or outdated. So, individuals who maybe have been using unprotected Wi-Fi. It might have been that you were using technology within your own homes which was out of date, or there was a known vulnerability in the software on your laptop. So looking very specifically for those quick wins. And obviously the common theme across all of this is that the fact that the targeted attacks were very much at remote workers. So moving on from cyber, but obviously a very clear link here. Cyber is one of the crisis that we've been trying to deal with over the last few months. It's clearly not the only risk that we've been faced with. And just thinking about crisis management and business continuity planning in what we call our new norm, obviously they're not new concepts, but there's never really been a greater test of a business's preparation for business continuity and crisis management than during this pandemic. So senior and operational leadership teams have always known that business continuity planning is important, but certainly what we found during the pandemic is that it's really brought it to everybody's attention as a very critical business activity. And judging by the thoughts of our scientists and politicians, if we look at what's being reported in the news today, there's lots of talk about a potential second lockdown. We all know that in the future, it's highly likely that we may be faced with another global pandemic, and we don't really know what the scale of that would be. So what have we had? We've had the pressure of many teams having to work from home, staff having to juggle family, health, financial concerns, and obviously the inability to travel. And that's basically exposed whether organisations have really been taking crisis management and business continuity planning seriously in the past. And these are only a handful of the issues if we think about what we've really had to tackle over the last few months. So having a plan in place to deal with major disruption is very, very different to actually being able to execute that plan successfully. And what we've seen is that many plans suggested moving teams, personnel, even operations to alternative locations or premises. And we know that that's not been possible during these lockdown measures. And additionally, there was always this view that technology had to be available, often as a contingency kit. But what we found again was that the volume of what was put aside as contingency kit was woefully insufficient to support an entire workforce working remotely, which is the situation that we all ended up in. So undoubtedly, we've got a lot to learn from the first half of 2020 about how to improve crisis management and business continuity, And particularly as we now move out of what has been the first phase of our lockdown in this current pandemic, and we start to adapt to what's going to be our new normal. So how do we prepare for the new normal? What then can we actually do? And if we think about this in a very simplistic form in terms of people, process and technology. So earlier on, Mike mentioned how core and key people is to everything that we do and how we think about our return to work. Process, Adam talked a lot about how we go about rethinking our risk environment and managing those risks effectively. And then clearly technology underpinning everything that we're doing now and will do even more so in the future. So the best way to really tackle business resilience is to focus on these as capabilities rather than thinking about plans and procedures and documentation alone. And actually having these base capabilities of people, process and technology established really will help to ensure that you have a sustained response to developing and to be able to develop so that when you have an uncertain situation, you can actually tackle that much better in the future as well. So from a people perspective, what do we need to do when we're rethinking business continuity? Well, as we move out of lockdown and into social distancing measures, businesses could in effect be operating under a very different and revised model. And it's really important that we start to think about continuity plans again in a very different way. You might also need to prepare to operate with a significantly reduced workforce, with limited certainty also on the ability of any third parties that you're relying on to play their part in the continued operation of your business model too. And in these instances, business continuity plans need to consider the loss of key resources, i.e. single points of failure, and ensuring that you've got some adequate contingencies in place to enable the continued operation of the business without these individuals. And your plans then will also need to be supported by stringent health and safety measures, ensuring that your employees are safeguarded from any potential threats posed by the virus, either now or if we have a second wave. So some key factors to think about. What reliance do you have on key individuals to support key business operations? How are you going to deal with them if they're not around? The failure of your key outsourced services or supply channels. What due diligence have you done? Again, what contingencies do you have in place if you don't have access to a key third-party service or provider? And then having updated contingency plans in place to oversee all of that. And then managing risks from a process perspective. Risk management remains a key exercise in deciding where to focus. Adam's already talked about that in quite a lot of detail. But we've also got to ensure that our senior executives maintain oversight and accountability for the risk management process. So whilst the risk of the pandemic actually was on most risk registers from what we'd seen, particularly organisations that were operating globally, actually what we missed was the likelihood of the risk materialising. On most risk registers, whilst the pandemic was featured, it was there as a risk which was very unlikely to materialise, right? It was deemed quite low in most instances. So what we're inevitably going to see now is many organisations either changing the risk profile of a pandemic on the risk registers or adding a pandemic to the risk register and really thinking about, well, how do we go about scenario planning a similar situation to the current one, particularly where offices and premises may be off limits again in the future. So some things to think about: timeliness and effectiveness of risk management processes and procedures, making sure that what you have in place is fit for purpose and up to date and current. Ownership of risks, again, senior executive ownership, scenario planning, thinking through, in effect, what could possibly happen, because we've seen, the one thing that we all thought was very unlikely did happen and it did materialise. And then putting in place supporting tools and also potentially thinking about, well, where do we need specialist input? Do we need some subject matter experts to come in and help us with some of this as well? And then last but not least, technology. Technology will be factored into all the new and amended plans to ensure both existing and new technology infrastructure can withstand another change in circumstance, or actually continued remote working over a long period of time, potentially for the foreseeable future. In fact, it's highly anticipated the pandemic started a new age of working, and one where we're going to be far more home-based and far less reliant on staff accessing office locations, particularly if the same job can be done remotely. And as more businesses move towards cloud-first, software-as-a-service models, better use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automation, all things that we're seeing coming very quickly now, there's going to be a greater reliance on the robustness of that technology infrastructure, and also where we're relying on technology partners, third-party services, the ability of those partners to provide reliable managed services and support, all in a very secure and robust fashion. So again, some key things to think about: IT strategic plans, which underpin your future business planning, making sure they're up to date. Do they include digital transformation? Do they include the introduction of any particular emerging technology which can support your business going forward? We've mentioned artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, for example, reliance on key third parties, looking at their financial and their operational stability, and also their ability to continue to support your business. And then not forgetting also disaster recovery plans, making sure that those plans that basically ensure that all of your technology is resilient and can operate, and in the effect of any of that technology failing, that you can resume operations very quickly, making sure those plans are up to date and exercised, and you've again been through some regular testing so that you know that they'll work when you need them to. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to Mike to recap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Some things to take away. I think it was quite difficult to narrow it down to 3, but we've tried our level best. And I guess we set those out here. And that is, the landscape is changing quickly. When this first arrived on our television screens some time ago, I think there was an eyebrow to raise, but since then we've had to move as businesses very, very quickly and respond to things on an almost hourly basis to make sure that we can work effectively. So going forward, it's going to be the same, and as Sheila just outlined, the reliance on technology is going to be critical. So we need to be agile, we need to respond to change, and we need to be flexible. Number 2, I think, has just been outlined by Sheila's last slide. As we move forward and we are more reliant on technology, business continuity planning is no longer a nice to have. The days of when that was something you dusted down once a year, put on your high-vis jacket and you wandered around are long gone. It's something that needs to be realistic, actionable, and regularly tested to make sure it's fit for purpose. On the plus side, whilst COVID-19 has been hideous, we can learn from this experience and understand the implications on our business for any future disruptions that we're going to have. We will be far more robust as businesses as we move forward, given the experiences that we've had from a risk management point of view. Okay, thank you all very much for listening. I think, Emma, we may have some questions.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, we've had a number of questions through, so we'll get through as many of them as we can. But looking at the first question, I think, Adam, I'll direct this one to you because it related to some of your content. You asked, which non-spreadsheet tools would you recommend to manage risks?
Okay, thank you, Emma. Thank you for the question as well. So, I mean, there are quite a few out there, non-spreadsheet tools for managing risk. RSM has its own Insight for GRC platform, which has a number of modules in, one being For Risk, which is a cloud-based tool. And, you know, be more than happy if there are any inquiries to follow up offline afterwards. But there are a few out there. Yeah, I think, yeah, please contact us if you'd like more information.
Thanks very much, Adam. Second question that we've got, and Mike, maybe this one could go to you. Do you have any tips on how best to manage non-executives, their anxieties around the potential lack of assurance through the pandemic and their increased desire to get involved operationally?
Really good question. I think just taking a step back from that and using my analogy earlier on, we are all in this together, and I think non-executives and their experience bring a breadth, obviously, to dealing with crises. But at the end of the day, the non-executive role is that of strategy and governance and holding to account the executive team. Having said all of that, it's reliant upon the executive team and indeed the assurance advisors to make sure that the non-executives are comfortable with the arrangements that are being put in place to discharge their responsibilities and also to manage the risks. So to paint a picture, we have found in the past that non-executives want to stray into the managerial role of things. However, that's usually because there is an information vacuum around them understanding what's actually being done in the name of assurance in particular. What this has driven, I think, is a process where non-executives are asking questions about what is being done, and they need reassurance and assurance about how that is being dealt with. We've certainly seen it with our clients that the internal audit plan and the assurance plans are being very, very quickly revisited to say, whilst we thought that was a good idea to do that review in the early days, we now need to change our focus on what's causing us angst at this point. Yes, we're getting some assurance from management, but we want some independent third-party review from a third party. Having said that, non-executive members have a wealth of experience, and many of them are running their own businesses and dealing with these things on a day-to-day basis. So I think communication is the key. And the final point from me, I guess, is if you've got the opportunity to get your assurance advisor, your head of internal audit in front of your non-executives to talk through the issues and understand the assurance profile and what's going to be provided, I think that's an excellent way of going forward.
Great, thanks, Mike. Sheila, this one is for you. Are organisations actually changing the way they handle cybersecurity and any breaches during and post-lockdown? And if they are, how are they doing that?
So what we've seen, Emma, is I think a heightened awareness of cybersecurity during lockdown. I think most organisations are very aware that they're not sitting within the confines of the office network infrastructure, and therefore that in itself does present a significant risk from both an operational resilience and also from a data security perspective. So we've certainly seen a heightened awareness, and as a result of that, many organisations are getting independent assurance around, what does the current landscape look like? Is it secure enough? Have we got any particular control weaknesses that we need to be focused on? Thinking about potentially investing in more tools or technology to monitor the network, not necessarily just again around performance and resilience, but also potential attempts to actually access the network in an unauthorized fashion, so cyber attempts. And yeah, I think there's just a much greater awareness of the fact that it's a very different place to what we were in a few months ago, and therefore you can't ignore cyber anymore. And where in the past many organisations may not have wanted to make an investment in technology, and particularly in the security space, it's a very different view now. And again, goes back to something I said earlier as well, Emma, that in general, even when we come out of this crisis, it's highly likely that we're going to operate in a very different environment, more so home-based working and less so everybody being in the office 24/7.
Great, thank you, Sheila. I'm actually going to stay with you if that's okay. I've got one around continuity. So the question is, are there any good toolkits for reviewing our business continuity plans in light of our experiences during COVID that could enable us to do a swift lessons learned exercise and take any necessary action in preparation for a potential wave 2?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is where I'd probably point you to either your assurance providers, an in-house audit team, or getting some specialist SME input potentially, because this isn't something that should be overly complex or overly engineered. However, it does need to be tailored for your organisation, the sector you're operating in, the size of your business. So it's not really a one-size-fits-all. I mean, there are business continuity tools out there, and I think the best source I would direct people to is the Business Continuity Institute, their website. You can find lots of information on there under the BCI website. But again, the tools that you see on the market range from something which is very simplistic on a spreadsheet, right through to some very complex tools, with sort of modeling functionality sitting between them, quite heavyweight, very expensive. So, it really does depend on what you're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. And I'll just take a final question. I think probably could go to Adam first, and then Mike, if you've got anything to add. So have boards been open to rethinking their risk management approaches in your recent experience? So Adam, if we could come to you first.
Okay, thank you. I think they have. I think that there's much more focus on a streamlined sort of risk profile and risk map, if you like, because I mentioned it earlier about seeing the wood through the trees. I think it's much more specific now. I think it needs to be more timely. I think that seems to be one of the demands there as well, because it helps to inform decisions that are needing to be made quickly on the direction of any response that has been taken, and that will continue to go forward. One of the other aspects is around risk appetite. We've had quite a few conversations over the last few months about people wanting to sort of revisit their risk appetite in light of what's gone on, particularly at board and exec level, because the way that their organisations are changing and evolving means that they need to, well, firstly update it anyway, but also they're going to need to take more risks in order to survive or to make up levels of income or service delivery. So I think that's a really interesting aspect in the way that organisations are starting to realise that actually having a clear and up-to-date risk appetite framework, or the board is particularly, is helping them make those decisions as well, quicker and more effectively. And Mike, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, from a practical experience, I think what it is driving in terms of looking at risk registers now is a much greater focus on the assurance. Risk registers in their early days were about identifying the risks and the controls, and in some ways the actual regular flow of assurances through to give comfort to boards and non-executive directors was not as good as it could be. This is now really driving that process, such that I've been at board meetings and indeed at audit committee meetings where non-executives are really pushing to understand, A, when are they going to get the assurance that they require that these controls are working effectively, that any continuity plans are up to date and are being driven through properly. So the assurance is a much greater focus now, I think, in terms of rethinking the approach on risk management. And it does create some tensions. And I've noticed another question come up in the chat with regard to the tensions between non-executives and executives. I think actually that's quite a healthy tension and should be encouraged, because at the end of the day, non-executives are there as a conscience, as the individuals from outside who can bring a breadth of experience to say, well, are we getting the right assurance? Is this working? So that, I think, is now driving a much more regular flow of both first and second line assurance, but importantly, third line independent assurance to boards via the risk management process.
Thanks very much, Mike. So I think we'll probably leave it there for questions, but if you do have any others, do email the website on your screen at the moment. And I do keep an eye out for next week's webinar, which will be on realising business value. We've also got a lot of insights on our website at the moment. So on our adapting to change pages, you can link them from our home screen. And just a final point really is don't forget to keep your preferences up to date so you can receive the most relevant insights and events to you. Any questions that we haven't had time to answer, we'll definitely be in touch to follow up. But as I said, you can also email the email address that was on your screen just then. So thanks again for listening, and we hope to see you soon.